first episode of Fireside Chats. In this podcast, we aim to highlight unconventional pathways and underrepresented voices in pre-health careers.
Yeah, so this is a Pre-Health Advising Office initiative. The Pre-Health Advising Office is here at Emory University to support all students on their pre-health journeys. And we hope that this podcast, similar to our amazing staff and advisors at the office, will also just be able to be another resource for pre-health students or anyone interested in the pre-health field. So I guess now we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. Elise, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Elise. I'm a senior and a peer mentor alongside Nicole at the pre-health office. I'm a bio major and anthropology minor. And just to give a little detail of my journey, so I came into college thinking I wanted to do either pre-med or pursue a PhD in biology. I love working with people, meeting new people, and find it so fulfilling to help others. But I also just love the intellectual engagement of research, and that's something I couldn't let go of. It really fulfills my curiosity. And so I just went on the pre-med track tentatively, enjoyed the classes I was taking, but throughout basically all of college, I was debating between those two paths, MD or PhD, and it felt like a never-ending struggle. For years, I would consult my professors for their advice, and then I would talk to professionals and med students, grad students later on in my sophomore year to figure out which I like better. And this was extremely helpful, hearing their stories and all of their advice, but even after learning so much about these paths and other paths, I could not make a decision to just one. It felt so limiting to just do one. And in my sophomore year, just to be specific, I thought I wanted to do an MD PhD. Later, through talking to people more, I realized that lifestyle wasn't for me, and I found a medical specialty I really resonated with called medical genetics. And I'd love to talk about this another time in another podcast episode, but basically, just to summarize, I felt like I was inching closer and closer to my calling through my years in college, but I never felt quite settled. There was still something missing. I felt like I was still sacrificing something really important to me, regardless of what path I took. But I also didn't really know what that something was, and I also I kind of just ignored that feeling for a while. But that all changed the summer before my senior year. I was studying for the MCAT, and I was super pumped and committed to pursuing med school. My head was in the game. But at the same time, I happened to have this pivotal moment. And what happened was just kind of by coincidence. I just happened to go outside the Emory bubble, basically. So for the first time, I was meeting peers who were doing completely different things with their lives and really just pursuing their passions without caring about things like prestige or just being influenced by others. So, for example, one girl I met, she wanted to be a marine biologist, and another one I met wanted to work for the National Park Service. And these were careers that I never even thought about at Emory. It never crossed my mind. So getting out of the bubble really opened my eyes to the possibilities of life. It made me reevaluate the reasons why I was pursuing medicine. It made me really question to myself, why do I want this, and do I really want this? And so I spent the next few weeks in sort of a chaos because it felt like I was questioning my entire world. I was more unsettled than ever, and I was just kind of an unnerving time in my life. And the way I went about it, though, was just taking some time to reflect, think about who I am and what I value in my life, and then also talking to others to get that, sort of sense of who am I. And I think that's something we forget to do, and I know I definitely lost sight of who I am and why I was going down the pre-med track. And from all this, this period of reflection, I realized that I really value flexibility in my life, for one, and two, exploring different lifestyles, meeting different people, exploring different worlds. Fundamentally, I realized at my core, I just love experiencing different things. And I realized this doesn't really align with being pre-med or going to med school, which is such a long, relatively rigid path, just personally not aligned with my goals. And, it was really scary to say I'm not pre-med after being pre-med for 3 years. It's been a big part of my identity. I had completed the path, basically. But I also knew that if I were to continue on, I wouldn't be fulfilled. So I went back to the drawing board and talked to a bunch of people. And long story short, I found genetic counseling. And this allows me to pursue all of my passions, which are like being able to get involved in clinical care, talking to patients, but also research, public health. I can get involved in industry if I want. And so this would give me the flexibility to do a lot of different things with my life. And I realized this was perfect for who I am. And I am just so excited to have finally found it and feel settled with my decision. But this is all to say college is about learning who you are, what your core values are, your life goals, and from there that will really help you decide on what your career path will be. And to give two pieces of advice, my number one advice is talking to people. Like I said, I talked to maybe 20 to 40 professionals or students in the fields I was interested in, and they gave me a lot of nuanced details that I wouldn't have gotten from, say, a website or brochure describing what an MD PhD does, for example. Talking to people is also how I learned about unconventional careers. There are a lot of careers out there that you just won't find on a list online. There are a lot of niche things that you can do, and I only learned these by talking to people in their respective fields. And this is a big reason for why this podcast is being created. I really hope other students can learn about career options through other people's stories. A second piece of advice I really want students to keep in mind is that we are so young. We are like 18, 19, 20, 21? I think we tend to forget that at Emory. We tend to think that we need to have everything figured out right now, as if our trajectories were just fixed after undergrad. But when I talk to adults successful in their careers, a huge proportion of them took a long time, spent time in their 20s, sometimes even later, like almost like 30s, figuring it out and changing their paths. And that's totally okay. This is the time to figure out what you will be doing for so-and-so years. And you'll also find, at least based on the experiences of people I've talked to, is that opportunities will probably and most likely come your way without any notice. So there's like possibility abound out there. And so one thing I hope this podcast does is normalize this idea that we don't have to have everything figured out right now, and we can take time and learn from trial and error. So that's my tips and my story. Nicole, what about you?
Yeah, so I also kind of entered college wanting to go down the pre-med path, and I think that really stemmed from my childhood. My mother's a nurse who worked at a private practice office, and oftentimes if she had to stay late at night, there was no one to take care of me after school. Like when I was in elementary school, I would stay in the office with her and kind of observe from afar. And what I saw just absolutely fascinated me. I became really interested in the physician role from that age. Because I just saw the impact that a physician can make on the people they treat, and not just being able to treat their physical symptoms and pain, but really being there as a part of a support system to listen to their problems at home or life stresses and providing additional help and support. I think that a lot of people come into a doctor's office feeling at their most vulnerable states, and being able to comfort them and provide an environment that is opening and allows them to ask questions, I think that is just so meaningful. So from the beginning, I kind of saw that as a possibility for something I would want to do in my future life. And so I continued wanting to become a doctor throughout middle school and high school. And I think what really fueled that was also falling in love with the sciences. I don't think I was ever really satisfied with the simple answers. I always wanted to know more about why something worked, how the human body worked, how our world works. And I think that the sciences really helped me explore that and get deeper in that, and not just get on the surface level of why a disorder happens, but science allowed me to get down to the actual mechanisms, the exact molecular pathway that had a mutation that allowed for a disorder to happen. So I really appreciated the sciences for that, and knew that I wanted to continue learning and growing more every year. And so I entered college again, said previously, continuing to want to go down the pre-med path, and here, I think really gaining exposure to the clinical setting has helped me want to pursue that path throughout really difficult coursework like organic chemistry and biochemistry, when I felt like maybe this wasn't the path for me, maybe I couldn't handle the sciences. Really having those experiences, interacting with patients and physicians, helped push me down this path and just allowed me to see what a privilege being a physician would be. And I've had some really amazing mentors in the past who have explained exactly why they chose the role as a physician, and being able to see them interact with their patients and, again, provide that safe space for them really helped me on my journey and helped me continue to want to pursue this path. I think that's something that also really drew me to the medical field that I only learned about in college was research and the extensive role that research plays in medicine. I mean, new publications are made every single week and day that allow us to advance and grow. And so, something that I want for my future is to never really remain stagnant. I want to continue to be learning and growing. And improving my skills and learning new technologies, learning about new mechanisms of action. And by becoming a doctor, I will not only be required but also privileged to understand that. And so I think I really appreciated how all of the doctors I shadowed or interacted with used evidence, used research, and were always staying up to date to that. And I think that it made the job really interesting. I mean, I also grew up reading Nancy Drew and so many mystery books. And I think that being a doctor, making a diagnosis is also kind of similar to solving a mystery and putting in the final piece of the puzzle, but this puzzle is actually one that will help improve a patient's life drastically. So I think that all of these experiences I've had throughout college have helped me continue to pursue the path. And so I actually just took the MCAT during the summer. So happy to have that done with. But a lot of times when I was studying for the MCAT, again, I would struggle with, am I in the right place? Am I smart enough for this? Can I really, really do this? And I think that also just getting through that has continued to make me want to become a doctor because I realize that I can do this. So I think that I'm going to give my 2 tips now. My first tip is understanding that imposter syndrome is so real. And just knowing that wherever you are right now in your career, in your path, you are here because you were meant to be here and you are smart enough and you are hardworking enough. And I know a lot of times, especially in competitive environments, we tend to doubt our own abilities and compare ourselves to our classmates and wonder if we ended up where we are right now by accident, and that is just so not true. So you are definitely where you are supposed to be. My second tip is to ask questions when you are interacting with professionals or with anyone. Come to shadowing, come to whatever setting you're volunteering at with questions. Ask doctors about their most meaningful experiences with patients. Ask about whether they ever experienced burnout. I think that this can help you continue to realize if this path is right for you and to explore other paths. So I think that being informed and asking questions is just so important. I think that goes along with imposter syndrome. I know when I was shadowing a physician, I was kind of scared to even begin to ask any questions because I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there and I was almost invading their space. And just knowing that all the professionals you interact with are really there to support you. They want to see you learn and grow, and you are the next generation of professionals, no matter what field you go into. So understanding that they do want to see you succeed is really essential. And so that is a little snapshot of my story. I'm sure we'll go into more detail in future episodes as well.
Yeah, you can't see me nodding because, this is a podcast, but I am nodding to every piece of it for her advice. So, yeah. To introduce the podcast episode today, so our guests are Dr. Batisky and Anil from the Pre-Health Advising Office. Dr. Batisky is a pediatric nephrologist and executive director of the office, and Anil is one of our amazing advisors. And Nicole, do you want to explain what they talk about?
So basically, they will talk about their own paths to their respective careers while giving really amazing advice for anyone looking to explore different career options or find resources to help them find their passions. That is all really in this episode. So let's not waste any more time and let's get into it.
Woo! We hope you enjoy. All right, so this starts off our first podcast episode. We have Dr. Batisky and Anil Shetty from the Pre-Health Office to join us today.
Thank you so much for listening in. We are so excited to get started with these incredible podcasters. So, why don't you all start by just sharing a little bit about your life and how you came to Emory? Whoever wants to go first can start speaking.
Dr. Batisky should go first because you've been at Emory longer.
I came to Emory in 2009, and I answered this question in a few ways, and people will often ask, what brought me to Emory, what keeps me at Emory, and they're interconnected, but different answers in a way. I was recruited here to the Department of Pediatrics, so I'm a pediatric nephrologist. That's my clinical hat that I wear. I was recruited to join a growing faculty of academic pediatricians, and I was the fifth nephrologist in the group at a time when our group was starting to cover a second hospital. So we have, for a long time, been involved with the Eggleston version of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and we were starting to cover Scottish Rite. So there was a need to have somebody who was a little bit more seasoned, not right out of fellowship. And I have a background in doing clinical research in kids with hypertension. So in the early part of the 21st century, I was doing a lot of clinical trials in kids with using antihypertensives, which led to one thing or another, and I was recruited here to start a program in pediatric hypertension as a nephrologist. And I left position as an admissions dean in a medical school, and really not long after I got here realized how much I missed my student contact. So I looked for ways to get involved in the life of students. I will say that very broadly because I found ways to get involved with medical students, but I had also found out that about a year before I arrived, this office called the Pre-Health Mentoring Office was just getting started here on campus. And so I started doing some volunteer work for that office that included things like helping with some of the programming, some of the networking, and the shadowing experiences. I was invited to be part of the advisory board. And I kept my hand in that office for a few years, and then ultimately was offered the opportunity to have a more intentional position as the executive director. So I'm the founding executive director of what is now the Pre-Health Advising Office. And in that time, I've also taken on other duties, including I'm a small group advisor in the School of Medicine, so I work with medical students from orientation to graduation. And I, last fall, took on the directorship of the educational activities for medical students in the Department of Pediatrics. I'm the clerkship director, and I still practice medicine a bit at a time.
Incredible. Anil, do you want to go ahead and
how do
share
you
your own story?
I mean, how do you even follow that? But I'll try. I mean, so, in the same vein of things, for me, I guess I can start a little bit about even going farther back. When I was in college, I went to the University of Florida. Go Gators, did a little Gator chomp. I know people can't actually see that on this recording. But, so I went to undergrad thinking I was going to be a lawyer. And I did quote unquote typical pre-law things. And I think those who might listen to this podcast might associate certain things with typical pre-med things. But so I did an internship with the state attorney's office. I took all the right classes. I took a class with, at the time there was a professor who was teaching classes even though he was a federal appellate court judge, and his class was very intense, and he didn't actually follow the university schedule because he had to be in court by 8:30. And so he said, if you want to take my class, even though university classes don't start until 7:30, my class starts at 6:45 a.m. sharp. And if you want to be in my class, you be in my class. So I took all 3 of his classes. I got the A's in his classes that you were supposed to get to find out if you were cut out for law school. I was going to, I got involved in things that I really cared about. Just an example of some of those things where I actually worked at the basketball stadium, partially because I had to support myself through school as a first-generation college student, but also I got involved in some campus mentoring positions. I think I was what you call like a version of like a tour guide and stuff like that. So there were things that I really cared about, like this concept of building community. And as that was all, I was an orientation leader in college. But those things started to maybe shift my perspective. And I think secretly in my heart of hearts, for a while, I think I knew that I didn't want to actually be a lawyer. And it took me a while to, I think, really come to grips with that. And I think maybe I'm giving away the farm early on in this introduction, but I think that's sort of, I think, a hope that we have for anyone who continues to listen to this episode of this podcast and future podcast episodes is, embrace exploration and embrace what you really want to do. Don't feel attached, and take it from me, like you can get attached and maybe not break off of what you want to do. And so that's how that went. And then I think in my senior year, I actually became what was called the workforce director for our basketball stadium. And it was a pretty serious position. I was managing a $1 million budget. I worked a lot of hours while still being a student, had 300 people reporting to me. So it really taught me a lot. And in that experience, I had what I would call a very transformative experience of supervising a training program, because at the basketball stadium, we were responsible for the actual day-to-day operations. So if we went from a UF gymnastics meet to a career center career fair, we were responsible for making not only those events happen, but the transformation in between those events happen. Or sometimes you'd get the notice that like, hey, guess what? ESPN is going to come. They want to do college game day inside the arena, so we have to figure that out. And so it was a pretty intense position, especially to have as a 21-year-old college senior. It was a little bit much at times, but what it really taught me is that my passion was in helping develop people and not in law. And I think I realized that kind of late. I think I was like about to take my LSAT. I was trying to write a personal statement, and I realized like I can't do this. And so I did eventually seek out, some of my mentors and relationships that I built through college. And, they asked me to kind of think about what was important to me. And I realized this concept of, it wasn't the work. The work was exciting. Yes, it was exhilarating and full of adrenaline when 3:00 in the morning, you have an hour left before game day, the game day crew shows up, and you still haven't laid down, the tarp, or you haven't laid down this, or you haven't laid down that, and you still have that deadline pressing. That stuff was exhilarating, but I also knew that I didn't want to do that forever. But what I did enjoy was the relationships in those moments, was seeing how people figured out how to problem solve. Because sometimes, we know how to lay out the bleachers, but sometimes the bleachers don't cooperate. So you got to problem solve, and you got to help people learn how to do that problem solving. So what I realized, it was the development of people, the relationships, like how you deal with those adverse moments, that was my thing. And I thought that I figured out that I was okay at helping people figure that out. So I really kind of boiled down to deciding that I was going to go into education. That was kind of broad, but I think higher education was what I kind of landed on at the time. So I went and did a master's in higher education, and then I actually ended up in the most law-like area of higher education, where I used to do student conduct work, academic integrity work, and I did that for, over the course of about 5 years. We won't get into the story of what happened, of why I left that work, but it became quite challenging at certain moments. There were certain types of cases that really became just very unsustainable for me personally in terms of my personal care and wellness. I was locationally rooted to being in Atlanta at the time. And so I had a colleague who had just joined this office called the Pre-Health Mentoring Office. And we caught up over dinner, and she was like, we have this great office that all we do is we advise pre-health students. And I was like, wow, that sounds interesting. Sure, I'll apply for the job. And I've fallen in love since. So that was in June 2016 is when I joined Emory and joined what was then called the Pre-Health Mentoring Office, and we rebranded to realized it was more of an advising, and it was much bigger picture than just the concept of mentoring. Mentoring can be very specific, and so we wanted to rebrand as pre-health advising, and I've worked alongside and under Dr. Batisky now for the past 5 years, and the rest of our team, and I think here we are. It's cool. I think we've talked about this before. Like, we've talked about the concept of putting together a podcast and sharing our own stories and helping people learn from these stories, and we are really big on that in PHA. Is we want people to learn from each other. And I'm a big believer in that, because, to go a little off topic, I'm pursuing a PhD and I'm doing it on transformative learning and supervision and the stories of people in those roles. And so for me, I think it's something that I care a lot about, and it's part of the reason what keeps me at Emory and keeps me in pre-health advising is I love helping people figure out how to learn from each other. And to me, that's, I think, hopefully the biggest thing that we try to encourage people to do, and that's why we're putting together this podcast and future episodes, and all the programming that we do is to help people learn from each other's experiences. And it's always so easy to compare yourself, but instead I encourage you to use the things that you see and experience and the people that you see and meet at Emory as teachers or resources or people that you can learn from, and not someone to worry about whether you stack up to them or stack up to some other, pre-med you heard about on Reddit or whatever. And if you go to those things, don't go to those things. But okay, I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of add there.
What I was going to say was I think it's interesting that I think of mentoring as much broader than advising.
Yeah.
I think of advising as, okay, here are the nuts and bolts of how you get from here to here, semester to semester. Whereas I think of mentoring as much more the sort of special sauce in between, and in some ways, another sort of similar word is coaching.
Yeah.
The coach is the person that gets you, across the finish line, so to speak, or gets you the win. And they're all interwoven and interconnected. And yet words matter, right?
Yeah.
So I do think there are roles for all of these kinds of experiences within the office. I was thinking about your points about your journey, Anil, and I guess I would want to know where was the spark that led you to even think I want to be a lawyer? And I mean, I'll say that because I talk a lot about motivation with most of the students I talk to. Even this morning, in a medical student session, we were talking a little bit about that. But I decided I wanted to be a doctor when I was like in kindergarten. And to me though, and I've had a time to articulate this and hone this message. So I always kind of use that disclaimer that I sound a little bit like articulate about this, but this wouldn't have been my message in kindergarten. But for me, the vocational call was the call to serve or to help. And I'm hearing similar things from your story.
Yeah.
And how my story played out was related to my maternal grandmother who had diabetes. And I love my grandmother, and we always had fun at my grandma's house, and she had diabetes. And I saw where medicine helped her at a point in time where there were no AccuChecks and no continuous glucose monitors or insulin infusion pumps. So she was in and out of the hospital. And I saw her being cared for by this, it was a man at the time, that was her doctor. And so in my little mind's eye, that's what I wanted to be. And then, the rest was just a matter of the details. You work your way through school, you're good at math and science, you want to help people. That's the equation. And I'll say this for posterity, people always say, oh, but that's so cliche. Well, it's a cliche if it's only words. If you back it up with some actions, and people have heard me say this before too, actions speak louder than words, things my mom taught me. That's a different story, right? I didn't go from just using those words. I did the volunteering and the helping, and I was an orientation leader. Loved to work with people. So it's fascinating to me that the stories are similar in some ways, yet we've diverged and found different ways to play that out. And for me, if nothing else, I always knew I wanted to be in an academic setting because I really do like learning. I like learning from other people. I like learning about other people. It's the stories.
Yeah.
It's the understanding where people are coming from that drive me to be curious about the world around me. So I think it's kind of fascinating that there are so many parallels, but yet some different outcomes, yet coming back together, we reconnect, working together as partners, if you will, in a place like the pre-health advising office.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get pretty deep here then to kind of talk about, I think you're right. I think where it came from was a place to serve and a place to better the community. And I think part of what eventually changed for me was I realized this is just my take on it. Anyone who might be listening to this who wants to be a lawyer. My brother's a lawyer, just in case anyone was curious. He ended up filling that gap in our family, so it worked out great. But, I didn't think for me personally that law was going to be the way that I was going to serve. Where it actually started is two things. Law became the thing for two reasons. One, I come from a immigrant household, so for anyone who might be listening and is of South Asian background, you probably know, and other cultures have this too, where there's kind of only three professions you can be: a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer. So it kind of was a process of elimination of like, I don't think I'm too good at science. I was fine, but it wasn't my forte. So I was like, well, both doctors and engineers need science, so I guess it only leaves me with law. So that's where that one piece started. And the other one is actually, wow, okay, I haven't talked about this in a while. But so I actually grew up in a neighborhood that was maybe a little bit of a lower socioeconomic neighborhood. We actually did have quite a bit of, I guess the best way to put it is drug activity. And one of my really close friends that I grew up with found himself sort of caught up in the life, if you will. And the best way to put it is he was a drug mule. He never sort of admitted that to any of us that knew that. And I remember in high school, all of a sudden, he wasn't riding the bus anymore with the rest of us because he had a shiny new red BMW. And then 2 weeks later, or maybe 2 months later, I'm sorry, maybe I'm losing time here, but he had another shinier, fancier car. And everyone was kind of like, his nickname was Squirrel, and everyone was like, Squirrel, what? How did you get these really nice cars? And he never talked about it because he didn't want any of us to get caught up in the life. And I appreciate him for sort of protecting us from that. Unfortunately, I'm sad to say that he was eventually murdered, and of course it was because of situations and gangs and all of that. And that actually is what made me was like, I want to help people realize like that you don't have to turn to this road to get yourself out. He was clearly trying to save his family and get out of there and all that. He really wanted to change that, and I think he saw that as his only way. And I saw law both twofold because it was the only thing that I thought I could do, but also because I thought it would be a way to help people change their behaviors, change their choices. Me personally, especially at least because I did so much internship work and such in criminal law, I really saw that I did not think that was actually the way that people's choices and behaviors would change. And instead, that's when I eventually realized that education was instead the platform for me to help people change their choices and their stories and figure out a new way for themselves. I think it is probably, to your point, maybe it sounds a little cliche, but, I do, still maybe even to a naive belief, sometimes still believe that education is the way that we can change our circumstances. And I think it's so cool that you ended up in academic medicine that way, because I think that's probably where our stories connect, is because, and that's how we've ended up together here, is because we believe in that notion of you can change yourself and change your story by educating yourself. But how did you know when you wanted to go into academic medicine? Because it is kind of interesting to go from I want to go be a doctor at 5 years old to then I want to be in academic medicine.
Yeah, I think I always liked school.
Yeah.
It was, and I always said, I would have stayed in school forever. Sooner or later, you do have to pay back the student loan. So the next best thing is you stay in academic medicine. So, you get to work at a school, work with students, what I don't know is where did I step over the line from being mentored to being the mentor? That I think is one thing that I do kind of reflect on a lot, because I think it's a constant ebb and flow. I mean, I still rely on advice from others, and some of those others are more senior to me. but some of them are more junior to me that it can teach me things. But at the same time, I'm, often in the more mentor role, advisor role, coach role when it comes to, junior students and things like that. So I went to medical school, even though I had this early interest in diabetes as an initial attraction, because what we do as pre-meds is get experience, right? We need to get a sense for, do we have a sense for what it's going to be like, knowing that we'll never know what anything is really like until we're in it. But I started doing some volunteer work. Again, the call to serve. And through the volunteer work, I found myself getting the opportunity to shadow. And with that said, the people that influenced me enough that by the time I started medical school, I thought I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon because that's the experience I had. And as I worked my way through medical school, I realized I kind of liked everything. At some point, I knew I wanted to be what I always say is where the action was. So to me, that was being in a teaching hospital, being in an academic medical center. And so I knew that before I even was settled on a specialty. But I also, again, I always talk about reflection. I fundamentally, I think, realized I was more of a medical person than a surgical person at that primordial branch point of differentiation. I like to talk to people. I like the problem solving. Surgeons do it in a different way, but my mind was more oriented toward a medical type of problem solving. And so as I worked my way through my third year of medical school, I, very late in my third year, did my required pediatric rotation, at which point I found my tribe. I could just feel so much more comfortable among the people I was working with, the residents and the attendings, loved working with the kids. And then, you look back and say, oh, I'm the oldest of 5. I'm always the oldest brother. I was always one of the older cousins in the brood. This kind of makes sense. How did I not even consider that working with kids was going to be what I wanted to do? And so for me, what all ties together in the academic world is watching students grow and develop into graduates or physicians, and watching patients grow and develop from infants into toddlers, into school-age kids, into high schoolers. Because my patients really range from premature newborns in the NICU to people I'm transitioning out of my practice at age 21, and then a lot in between. So I think it sort of makes sense to me. And then being grounded in the academic setting, you get the opportunity to really work with people from all sorts of backgrounds.
Yeah.
I think if we're talking about transformational experiences, one for me happened, I guess I went to a small liberal arts college, which was on the quarter system at the time. And I was a chemistry major, just happened to fall into that bucket. But I was always interested in the humanities and things outside of just the hardcore sciences. And one of my favorite courses as a sophomore was a history course called Knights, Peasants, and Friars. And it was a medieval history class.
Wow.
And it was just a really, really interesting, fun class. I still, somewhere in my archives, have a copy of our written final exam.
That's awesome.
That had one question: what were the Middle Ages? And I quoted, somebody will probably recognize the author, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And
I started a paper too with that.
my junior year, the same professor, Professor Will Hoffman, was offering a 3-week study abroad course to London called Historic and Literary London. So I went to London, I think my first time ever on a plane, to fly from Cleveland, Ohio to London, England, to spend 3 weeks with 17 students, none of them I'd met before the planning meetings for this trip. And that, to me, was very transformational. You know, London in 1981 was very different than London any time more recently. In fact, this is where it comes full circle. 25 years later, I got to go back as a faculty member to London, leading a study abroad trip with 20 Ohio State undergrads. And I could compare and contrast. You know, in 2006, we have ATMs. We had to have traveler's checks in 1981. In 2006, we have cell phones with international coverage. Back in the day, I called my parents to say, I got here on a payphone, collect call. I'll see you in 3 weeks. And in 2006, I'm having my students call their parents 3 times a day. You know, the juxtaposition, yet the Tower of London looked pretty similar.
Wow.
Houses of Parliament looked pretty similar. So it was really kind of fascinating. But travel, to me, has been part of those transformations. And, you know, more recently, BC, before COVID, you know, I spent a few trips going to Italy as part of, you know, one of the Emory trips. And I just love traveling. I love the cultures. I love the people I meet on those trips. Even the people, the Emory people, who come from so many different places. And when you're in a neutral place, like a place that nobody calls home, you can really lay down arms and really get to know people in a very different way. So to me, but 1981, it was December 1981, I can pinpoint as a true transformational experience, because it was my first international trip, period. And to go that far as a kid from northeastern Ohio was really pretty remarkable.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Do you find that, you know, engaging with people from diverse backgrounds, hearing their stories, helps you find yourself, your own path?
I think it does. You know, I think what I find with trying to be open to the concept of cultural humility is that we are all individuals, and I think have much more in common than we do different. You know, I'm old, right? I feel like I've been doing this a long time.
But you're young at heart. You're young at heart.
I am. But yet, you know, what's amazing to me is that I've boiled it down to, you know, there are 2 key fundamental elements of the human condition that are so common, no matter where we grew up, our parents' background, our native tongue, wherever in the world we grew up. We are imperfect beings, and we're mortal.
Yeah.
And kind of playing off something Anil said earlier, because it's a common theme here, helping others who are in this world is really what it ought to be about, right? We are all going to make mistakes. We are all imperfect, and we are all not going to be here forever. So why shouldn't we try to find a way to make it a little bit better for every one of us? So I do think getting to the point about the diversity piece, that to me is what makes it so interesting. If we were all exactly the same, thinking the same way, doing the same thing, that would get pretty tedious after a while. So the curiosity of, tell me about yourself. Is there anything more? Cues me into how I should engage you maybe as a patient. You know, we teach our medical students to begin their history with 3 open-ended questions. So why are you here today? Can you tell me more about that? Is there anything else? And if you give the patient the time to answer the questions in their own words, you gain much more insight than if you start asking, where's the pain? What makes it worse? What makes it better? Now, you might need those fine details, but sometimes they'll tell you that whole story without being prompted. So I think the diversity piece is what keeps it so interesting and exciting. You know, not even people from the same background don't always have the same exact ideas. And you won't know unless you're curious enough to ask and interested enough to listen to the answer. I think that's the other thing. You can ask the question, but then you've got to listen and pay attention, because it's not just about going through the motions, but really trying to be guided by compassion and empathy. You know, put yourself in somebody else's shoes and feel for them what maybe you don't yet understand until you ask enough questions to get there.
I know you two are the hosts, but I'm going to steal the spotlight for a second. I'm curious because it's come up a lot. And we talk a lot about this as advisors, and I'll speak for our other advisors as Kim and Hugh. And you've probably heard me say this as your advisor, Elise. Hugh, I mean, Nicole is probably, and Hugh, you've heard it from Hugh. You've probably heard us say it in workshops and stuff like that, of just like how important, and you said it earlier, DB, of how important reflection is.
Right.
I'm curious for you two, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it too. How do you enjoy reflection, or what is maybe your favorite way of reflecting? Because I do think, to everything that we've been talking about today, this idea of learning from others, learning happens in that critical moment of reflection. So I'm curious to hear from you two as learners, and from you as a continued learner, and I'll share too at some point, but what's your favorite way of reflecting, or how do you best reflect? And, just tell me about maybe your own reflection processes.
I can go ahead. I think that something that's really helped me reflect, especially over COVID. I mean, I was having so many maybe doubts about the path I was on, and just so many questions. And so I actually started journaling, and that has helped me so much. Every morning, just getting my thoughts out on paper, it's just opened up new questions. And every single time I journal, it starts somewhere and it just goes in all of these different directions, and it just helps me kind of bring a focus to my thoughts and really kind of put that down on paper. And then sometimes I like to go back, and that brings up new questions. But all of this has helped me really reflect on why I'm doing what I'm doing. And especially, I'm really happy I actually started journaling during COVID, because when I was studying for the MCAT, that was a time when, again, I was also starting to have doubts about, am I smart enough to go in this path? Do I deserve to be a pre-med and go into the medical field? And just journaling and kind of working through those thoughts has really helped me reflect on my own past experiences and experiences I want to have in the future. That's really helped solidify my desire to be a physician and go into the medical field. So definitely journaling has been a great resource for me, and something I would recommend for other students who are also struggling with ideas about the future and questions about themselves.
Yeah, beautifully said. I also journal. I think for me, though, when it comes to reflection, I think I kind of take it as more like a conversation. So I tend to reflect on my experiences, what I've heard from other people, and from there I sit on those thoughts throughout the day, and then I go back into the world and engage again and ask more questions to try to figure out, okay, what is my path? Who am I? What am I really passionate about? What would I be happy doing? So yeah, I guess I don't have a material method of it, but my whole path has really just been talking to people and learning from their experiences, and learning from my own experience as well, of what I like and what I don't, and who am I. I think also recently I've just been really interested in learning about myself from a kind of I don't want to use the word psychoanalyze, but I mean that's kind of what it is. I think it's really interesting learning about who I am and why I'm interested in certain things. Yeah. And it's given me a lot of perspective by going deep down into some of my, I guess, early life experiences.
That is so interesting, because I feel like you brought up two really amazing points. First of all, it's important to have conversations with other people, but it's also important to have a conversation with yourself and to know yourself. And I think that a lot of that stems from also just being able to be by yourself, being able to know yourself well enough to be comfortable with that.
Yeah. I think when you go into a new environment too, say going to London or going somewhere abroad, a new part of the country, a new whatever you're doing in college, I think you've put yourself in a position where it's you're not just an amalgamation of a bunch of different influences, but you can really see yourself in a new environment and know who the core you is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think part of being in a new environment is Dr. Batisky brought up the past, throwing yourself into new shadowing experiences or volunteer work or anything that can help you find your own path. And so going along with that, we would love to ask both of you, what is the biggest advice you can bring for Emory students or students listening to this podcast who are trying to explore their own career paths and trying to find themselves?
Oh, there's so many pieces of advice, right? I think the things you've both said are helpful. You can look at guiding principles. I mean, the AAMC puts out the core competencies, and I'm hearing intrapersonal and interpersonal competency, communication as some of those competencies. But, certainly being willing to try new things, being open to the experience and what it teaches you, because sometimes we have experiences that teach us maybe that's not the right fit for us. Being open to advice from others. There are countless ways to think about it, but I do think that a campus like this that allows you to explore all kinds of clubs and organizations, it's sometimes a mixed blessing, right? I have so many options. There's such a broad menu. Where do I even start? So I think, again, getting to your earlier point about knowing your core self is helpful, while trying to be willing to try some new things too. It's a little bit of both. You sometimes don't know something's going to taste good until you've given it a try, or you don't know if it's going to be a good experience until you've had it. But then sometimes you have to be willing to say, okay, I tried that and maybe it didn't work, so I have to redirect myself. I think having trusted confidants, be it friends, parents, advisors, who can be a sounding board for you, is useful, because if you have somebody that you trust and respect, then they can sometimes be a sounding board for trying ideas. I was struck with, when I think back to reflection, we all do things differently. Journaling or thinking or mindfulness practices, just being present in the moment and just letting things happen without having to actively do something is helpful too. So those are some thoughts for me.
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, where to even go, right? We've touched on a bunch of different things too, like this concept of reflection. Like how important that is. That's like something I would want to impart to people. This idea of like not comparing yourself to others, so important. Embracing your own path and your own journey. I'm going to sort of highlight a different one. It's going to maybe sound a little weird, but I think one that I would say, and I think all of you have experience with this, and I know that all of you have experience with this, is being comfortable with hearing no and asking questions that the answer might be no. Because I think the number one thing that we get as advisors, and if we're talking specifically about the pre-health journey, is, so how do I get into research? How do I get into clinical experience? How do I go shadow? How do I decide I want to be an orthopedic surgeon or a pediatric nephrologist or anything else? You have to ask questions and maybe be brave and call people or email people that you don't know or that you might expect to hear the answer no from. And sometimes you don't actually want to ask that because no one ever likes to hear no. But my advice is going to be, get comfortable with hearing no. No isn't necessarily bad because no is the default. So if you don't ask the question, if you don't go seek out that resource, if you don't go ask that professor about, would you, I know it's kind of different in the DC era of during COVID era, but like, I know it's awkward maybe sometimes to ask people to go get coffee or go get lunch and stuff like that. And we're all having different ways of navigating this experience of being in the middle of a pandemic. But if you don't ask those questions of like, can I go get coffee with you? Can I try to be a learning assistant for you? Can I try to be in your lab? Can I reach out to this person and ask them to be a doctor or to shadow this doctor? Can I email this clinic and ask if I can volunteer there? If you don't ask those things, then you won't change the actual answer, right? If you don't ask, the answer is no. But if you ask, sure, the answer might still be no, especially right now during COVID. But if you ask and someone says, sure, why not? Or someone says, yeah, let's give it a go. Then all of a sudden you've possibly changed the entire trajectory of your life, because it could very well be the transformative moment of you studying abroad, or the transformative moment of me, see something that, no, I didn't actually see it, but, experiencing something I didn't have to experience, or you two experiencing the things that you've experienced. And, I'm sure you talk about it at some point over the course of this podcast series, but your own journey from figuring out what you want to do to now deciding what you want to do. But that's probably my advice is ask questions even if you think the answer is going to be no.
Yeah. And I think that you need to be comfortable enough with yourself and
Yes.
not take it personally when you go ahead and do that. I think
Yeah.
a lot of life is taking risks, and I mean, you wouldn't be living without doing that. So
Definitely. And it is those questions that you are scared about getting a no to that can result in the best possible circumstances and can help shape your entire trajectory. And I will also add on to that, it really only takes one yes out of like a sea of no's to get all of the opportunities you desire, and to really take advantage of that yes and see, can I make further connections through this one opportunity, and really just taking full advantage of that yes.
yeah. And I think one other thought is not being afraid to ask yourself those hard questions, because I think in my journey, it was really hard to ask those hard questions. Am I still pre-med? Or do I really want to do research my whole life? Do I want to be in the clinic my whole life? All those questions, and very truthfully answering them to myself was really difficult, and it took me honestly years to really decide and tell myself truthfully of what I want. So how much time do we have?
I think this is a great time to put out the fire, as Dr. Batisky so wisely put earlier. And we will just end on a final question that we think will really help our Emory students.
Okay.
So we just want to ask you, what is one resource both of you would suggest for our Emory students, again, finding their own career path? So a resource.
I can start. I think I was actually talking to a first year about this very morning. We have such a community of peer leadership at Emory. So I'm going to be kind of biased here and plug the PHA peer mentors, and you two are amazing, and every other 36 of our team is amazing. But I'm not just necessarily just talking about PHA peer mentors. I think take advantage of the peer leadership on this campus. There's so much built-in peer leadership. There's your orientation leader, your sophomore advisor, your resident advisor, your chem learning assistant, your bio learning assistant. I'm probably missing a PHA peer mentor. I'm missing, I'm sure, your EPAS tutor. There's so much built-in leadership, peer leadership, and peer mentorship on this campus, and I think I would just really push anyone listening to this podcast. It doesn't matter whether you're a first year, a second year, third year, fourth year, or not even an Emory student. Find someone who's older than you, who's traveled this path, and take advantage of that peer leadership. But if you're at Emory, take advantage of the peer leadership, but particularly the PHA peer mentors. Come see Elise and Nicole. But DB,
and I'll take a different tack. I would totally agree with that. But to add something else as a resource, I always plug the Association of American Medical Colleges, AAMC.org. They have a treasure trove of links for students who are exploring healthcare as a career, and lots of really reputable sites of information that include stories from people outside of Emory, because while we have a great bubble here, there's a whole world out there, and especially if you feel like you don't look the part or feel the part or act the part, I think hearing stories from other people you can find in there. aspiringdocs.org is one subsegment, but you can get lots of reliable information that's not.
That is the key. That is the key. Reliable.
Because we do want to believe in evidence, but there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into this too. But that, I think, we have a lot of internal resources, and that would be a great external resource.
Definitely use a lot of those stories, read up on them, so I can really add to that statement.
Yeah, and I love that you said that, because that is the purpose of this podcast, is to highlight those voices that might be underrepresented in the healthcare field, and to help you all listening learn from them and see yourself in them. So with that, thanks for thinking of us as your first guest.
This was fun.
Yeah.